I am going to make a short introduction to explain to you why I have invited Christophe Péchoux from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to explain to us some stuff which I think he would be the first to say was a bit even new to himself. I'm very grateful to Christophe because he went off dans la maison in the house asking people what has happened in the past. And I'm explaining this because the way that intergovernmental organizations work tends to be both the same and different. And during the past 33 years, 34 years now, my main experience personally was at the Council of Europe in Strasbourg and at the European Commission in Brussels, during which I have participated in the creation of various new legal instruments. I think more than 20 at one count, sorry, not one go. And these varied from full-blown treaties, like the Cybercrime Convention, to recommendations which started off as soft law, like Recommendation 8715 on data protection and the police, but which then ended up very much as hard law. As you heard me say yesterday, that recommendation, if you were one of the 10 countries trying to get into the European Union in 2004, you couldn't even go in unless you put that into your hard law. And everything in between. From recommendations on data protection and insurance, data protection and new technologies, data protection and medical data. Jean and myself, I shudder to think Jean 22 years ago now published a paper where we actually were tracking what was happening, for example, to our 4 years of work on producing the new European recommendation on data protection and medical data. And there's always an extent of cross-fertilization. During that time, when I was chairing the Committee of Experts on Data Protection and were piloting the European recommendation going through, the Americans, including the Department of Health and Department of State, Department of Justice, were also consulting with me because they were about to produce HIPAA in the United States. I'm not taking any credit for anything. All I am saying is that there is cross-fertilization. There are certainly a number of things in HIPAA which I wouldn't have done the way that they have ended up today. There is a process, but one thing which I believe in common in the processes is that the processes, as they differ from one country to another and one intergovernmental organization to another, also focus around people, initiatives, and timing. So if, for example, you were going to see what happened in Sweden and how the data protection law happened there, Sweden has a long-standing tradition of commissions, right? Of commissions which go and give advice, and they, to a certain extent, often take the initiative. In the Council of Europe, we had a particularly interesting history on how we got to our intergovernmental legal instruments, how we made European law on that part of human rights which deals with privacy, right? Convention 108, the European Convention on Data Protection, doesn't beat around the bush. It tells you clearly in its recitals, I exist in order to give life to Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights. It makes a direct reference to the fundamental right to private and family life, which we have in Article 8, which corresponds closely to Article 12 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and closely to, therefore, Article 17 of the ICCPR. What happened, though, is that for that particular incident, America sneezed and Europe caught pneumonia. Because what we see is a very interesting debate happening in the United States between 1967 and 1975, where you had the ramifications of the reaction to a task force set up by the US president asking what to do in computing, and its report of 1966, which led to Senate subcommittees from 1967 examining the matter, but also which coincided with a huge interest in the United States arising directly out of surveillance. I will summarize this very briefly, but the main concern was actually internal surveillance, right? So if you look carefully what happened in the US, and especially in the US Senate, between 1970, the 1st of May 1974, and the 31st of December 1974, you will see a number of revelations leading to Senate inquiries, leading to, on the 1st of May, the filing, the opening of the formal discussions on what was to become the Federal Privacy Act of 1974, which was signed into being on the 30th or 31st of December, if I remember correctly, of 1974. I'm saying this because what was happening in the United States, and which continued to happen in the United States, things didn't stop in 1974. In 1975, we have between 75 and 77, we have 14 reports of the Church Committee. We have the developments which led to the development of FISA, and an intense debate which attempted to set up a number of safeguards in the United States, primarily for US citizens, though there was some thought about non-US persons, right? Europe was watching carefully. And if you notice, the first resolutions in Europe, and this is why I'm talking about actors, the first resolutions came out of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, right? And those resolutions led to tasking the Committee of Experts on Data Protection, the CJPD as we used to call it, which in 1976 began working as a result of the parliamentary initiatives, began working on two things. One, and they were both heavily influenced by the Americans. One, the text for the Council of Europe's Convention 108, which was finalized by 1980 and then opened for signature in January of 1981, and also the first recommendation on the protection of medical data. That too influenced by the reports on in the United States presented on medical data. This was a seminal moment for privacy and data protection, because at the same time, the OECD was coming out with its guidelines under the chairmanship of the eminent Australian judge, Michael Kirby. And in his subsequent meetings with myself, Michael has also, but he's now spoken openly and published about the dynamics of how that happened. And if people are interested in his opinion of how the OECD happened, guidelines, it is really very interesting indeed, because he identifies each actor and what they brought to the table in a very sweet anecdotal way in a couple of speeches he gave in Australia over the past 2 years. This meant, however, that Michael in Paris was constantly traveling to Strasbourg for the meetings of the CJPD. So there was cross-fertilization there between what would become the OECD guidelines and what would become what is today the world's largest, most successful legal instrument on privacy and data protection, which is Convention 108. What happened then, however, is, and I'm saying this in order to bring into sharper focus the role of intergovernmental dynamics, is the following. We then got the CJPD, which continued to function for at least 20 years. I mean, I left the CJPD in early 2001, and shortly after that, they cut off its funding. The body which today safeguards Convention 108, the TPD, which is the consultative committee which arose out of the creation of the convention, only started to function a few years later after 1985, because Convention 108 only came into force in 1985 when the minimum of 5 countries had ratified it. And then we had a dual development in Europe, which is the TPD would meet once a year, eventually twice a year, to deal with matters arising with the convention, but the development of legal instruments was left up to the CJPD, right? So, whatever we were doing in the CJPD produced a number of recommendations, as I was saying, on the police and data protection, medical data, social security data, because the idea was to have a 3-tiered approach. At the top, you had the constitutional approach, which is the declaration of high principle as a right in both the European Convention on Human Rights and the constitutions of some countries, like the Spanish Constitution, which ironically was the first to introduce data protection at the constitution level, but they hadn't bothered to make a law for a number of years. So we were all tearing our hair out in Strasbourg, wondering how on earth we can admit them to the convention. And at the same time, writing out a number of recommendations which had huge influence, certainly not only in European law, but as I was explaining, I just gave the American example, but we had countries. I mean, Marie-Georges, myself, and others have traveled to so many countries to train people in whether it's the police, whether it's the judiciary, whether it's policymakers in various aspects of privacy and data protection law, that we can see also why the vast majority of countries on the planet, those of them which went for some form of privacy and data protection law, seem to have voted with their pens for something which looks much more like the European model of tackling privacy protection rather than the US model of doing so. The approach, however, in both the US and Europe was pretty sectoral, right? In Europe, it was structurally hierarchical. In other words, you had the European Convention of Human Rights at one level, Convention 108 below that, and below that, you had all the laws of many countries which were attempting to transpose Convention 108 into their national laws. The EU, and it's important that we don't confuse the EU with the Council of Europe, as so many people unfortunately tend to do, the EU was constantly trying to play catch up with the Council of Europe. I don't see Bruno this morning, but I would look at him with a teasing wink. But we have to remember the way that things went in the EU. Basically, 6 months after Convention 108 came into being, and I'm saying this to give you the dynamics of the intergovernmental work that went on there, the European Commission sent out a letter to all its members, and remember, at that moment in time, how many members did we have in what was not even the EU then? Not yet. We're going from 5 to 7 to 12, and we only got to 12 and then to 14, and then we suddenly went to 24, right? But at this moment in time, the European Economic Community, as it was still then, EEC, was relatively tiny, right? We have to remember that the EU almost doubled in size in 2004. Before that, it was still hovering between 7, 12, 14 countries. 5 years, 10 years passed almost. And do you know how many countries had ratified Convention 108 from the EU? 5 out of 12 by 1990. So the Commission said, and I was already involved in the negotiations then, the Commission said, okay, we said that it's a good idea to sign up to Convention 108. You haven't signed up to Convention 108. What we'll do is we'll have our own directive. Right? And we spent from 1990, Marie, to 1995 negotiating behind the scenes and in front of the scenes insofar as obtaining a consensus on the directive which we know as Directive 4695. Part of the dynamics of that intergovernmental work was that we had at least one country, historically the United Kingdom, which dedicated enormous effort not to have a directive. I remember my friends and colleagues inside the Home Office, telling me, Joe, I have to dash off with the Home Secretary because we have an RAF jet taking us around Europe trying to persuade everybody not to go for a directive, right? And I'm saying this not because I have anything against the Brits, I'm just telling you what my friends traditionally, and friendship it was, ladies and gentlemen. Because the way that a lot of intergovernmental work was going then was left up to the committees of experts. In other words, whether it was in Brussels or it was in Strasbourg, there would be open discussions on the recommendations, etc. Some of the member states were more, how shall we put it, nationalistically representative than others. In other words, if you had, and remember, we started off in 1990 with 19 member states at that moment. And we had 21 officially, but only 19 came up. And I'm explaining this in order to give the context for how much more complex it is within the UN, right? After 1990, we gradually grew to 47 at the Council of Europe, which made things much more complex. Because we went to the Council of Europe harboring 25% of the world's countries, right? So it's a very important regional grouping. What happened insofar as the laws were being developed was a very interesting dynamic at the international level, where you had a mixture of technocratically led lawmaking because you had the experts on data protection, which comprise normally of two sorts. Some, like Marie-Georges, came from the CNIL, the local, the National Data Protection Authority, etc. Others came from the ministry concerned, but they were generally domain specialists, right? Over the years, they had built up quite a fair amount of domain expertise. And the ministers in each country were rather careful not to go against the advice. So in Europe, the dynamics at that moment in time during the 90s were as follows. We had all the countries of Europe ending up with Greece and Italy in 1996 to 1998, who were busy transposing Convention 108 into their national law. The directive hadn't yet really appeared on the firmament before 1995. And at the same time, we had a bunch of recommendations which were soft law, non-binding, but which, if you attended the sessions in which we were developing them, you wouldn't have thought they're non-binding, because people were squabbling over every single comma. So the dynamics of that happening was then that the coffee breaks, the lunch breaks, and the dinners were the times when we held most negotiations, right? When I would spend some time with the British delegation, some time with the French delegation, some time with the German delegation, often putting them together. I had a good ally in the Netherlands because my colleague from the Netherlands could play the piano, so I would organize some sessions in a place where we had the piano and kind of move things along. And we succeeded, I would like to think, in producing a number of recommendations which had a profound effect across Europe. Because most people did not wish to be accused that their national domestic law was not in line with the Council of Europe's recommendation on the subject. These dynamics began to change when the directive came along. Because when the directive came along, we started to have the famous coordination meetings. And at one moment in time, I would turn on the delegates who were forming part of the EU, which was a growing body. So remember, today we have 28 members of the EU who are also members of the Council of Europe. All of them have ratified Convention 108, which is why I can openly tell the UK, Brexit is irrelevant to you, right? You've already undertaken to observe obligations vis-à-vis national security. Dear Mr. Ben Wallace, don't try to lead us down the garden path. Whether you Brexit or not, whether the EU has competence over national security or not is irrelevant. The United Kingdom has already bound itself to apply the principles of privacy and data protection law to national security. Go and read Article 9 of Convention 108. The UK has not entered any reservations on that. So, what happened when the EU came into the picture? While the Council of Europe has been a runaway success when it comes to especially the European Court of Human Rights and several areas of law, and now with two leading instruments, Council of Europe's Convention 108 on data protection and Convention 185 on cybercrime. There are other successful instruments, I'm just mentioning two of them. What happened was that the lawmaking process started to change. Because the growing number of subgroups in the Council of Europe, which were members of the EU, started forming what became the most influential bloc. Basically, we found ourselves in a position intergovernmentally that unless and until we took into account the coordination meetings in Brussels, which were held about anything which we were doing in Strasbourg, we couldn't push something through. That is the truth of the matter, right? And it's still an even bigger truth today, where this bloc has grown from 5 countries to 12 countries to 28 countries. These dynamics are very important. I don't have the time to go into the full history of the dynamics which was happening in Europe, right? Nor indeed at the United Nations. But we ended up in a position where, while the Council of Europe continued to take a lead, and in fact was financed by the EU to carry out certain work, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, and certainly on cybercrime, and more recently even on data protection, okay? The financial muscle of the EU wins the day, right? The Council of Europe's budget has been shrinking. New countries like Russia are trying to pull their weight, not always in a helpful way. And at the same time, the EU, because of the relatively strong stand that it took on data protection leading up to the GDPR, and to the financial muscle of the EU in its negotiations with the United States, we've seen the developments which we call first safe harbor and then privacy shield, right? Now, these intergovernmental dynamics have continued to become even more complex. In other words, when somebody asks me, so Joe, what is the incentive for Australia or Indonesia or Malaysia for going towards any international agreement on privacy, right? The truth is, at this moment in time, that whether we agree that it is good or not, whether we agree that it is morally correct or not, the European Union is almost equally as guilty of extraterritorial reach in its legislation as the United States is in others. Because certainly, GDPR is going to have a whopping effect, what I call the backdoor effect, on privacy law across the world. Because frankly, and we have to remember this very clearly, and I go back to my days when I was only a part-time academic and still working full-time in practice, especially in the software industry, and I think of, okay, so I'm rolling out a product, whether it's a new patient product for hospital management, whether it's a new product for hotel management. Now, as the manager of a software company, it is in my interest to keep down the number of versions that I produce, because otherwise I'm going to have to maintain so many versions. This is the way the industry works. Dan and others in the room have worked in the industry and they know how it works. So, hang on. If you're in a company in India, or a company in Indonesia, or indeed a company in the United States, and you're writing software, you want to make sure that your software is compliant with the GDPR. And then, with all due respect, are you going to write another version for the Indian market or the Malaysian market or the American? Of course not. If anything, you might switch off some features if you're forced to, but otherwise you're going to try and keep everybody working on one version. And that effect, as well as a number of others into which we don't have the time to go into today, is part of the hopefully positive effect that the GDPR will have across the world. But if anybody contests the fact that it's not extraterritorial reach, we will laugh them out of the room, because that would be dishonest, right? Now, these dynamics that we see going on obviously fuel the interest of a number of countries to go along to both Strasbourg and Brussels and get their privacy legislation endorsed, accepted, call it what you will. So why do you think Japan is spending so much time, and why poor Bruno Gencarelli is going to have to Tokyo so many times to try and get adequacy from the European Union, right? Because it is in the interest of Japanese industry to be compliant with the GDPR. And of course, the GDPR, because of the dynamics which I have described, will continue to walk in sync with Convention 108. No, let me reverse that. Convention 108 will continue to walk in sync with the GDPR, because the bloc of 28 countries will not permit, as they did not, the Convention 108 to move out of sync of GDPR. In fact, if you look at the draft revision of Convention 108, you will see so many things, including the wording, taken from the GDPR, so that the block of 28 can rest assured that when the new version of Convention 108 comes into force, they don't have to change anything, right? Now, I've taken some time to describe what's happening in 25% of the UN's membership, plus a whole host of countries who are not part of the 25%, but who are striving to be compliant with the rules applying inside that 25%. These are the dynamics of what's going on. Now, when you have international negotiations going on, the first rule that you learn is that you can trust nobody, right? Because when it comes to negotiations, what happens? Whatever you're negotiating, you are going to find some of the countries, and principally some of the major powers, leaning on others to get their way. Whatever we're negotiating about. I mean, after 33 years of working in human rights law, I've seen so many unexpected alliances just because somebody has lent on somebody else, that I cease to be surprised at anything, right? In other words, and those of us who have worked in this sector know precisely what I'm talking about, is it unheard of that the German and the French governments will have negotiations with somebody in a side room and then come out and tell the others, I think we're going this way, you know? How many times has the United States exerted pressure on its allies? Overtly and covertly. I would mention one example, but there are at least a couple of 100 million. When SWIFT moved from the United States to Europe, all of a sudden, a whole bunch of European MEPs, whom previously the Vice President of the United States and the Secretary of Commerce of the United States had never heard of, suddenly were receiving calls from them. You know, we want you to take the vote this way. Is it wrong? Of course it's not wrong. Every country has a right to try and move what it perceives to be its interests forward. But these are the dynamics of the game. Unless we are realistic, unless we know how to deal with it, no legal instrument, including the one we're discussing today, will go forward. And let us remember that if a week is a long time in politics, a day is an eternity in international negotiations. Because something which wasn't happening before, something over which you can have no control, whether it's Assad in Syria, whether it's somebody else, will lead to a new international way of thinking, which will mean a whole bunch of horse trading in the corridors, which will mean you will have thought on Tuesday evening that you have an agreement. Wednesday morning, you wake up, there's been a cruise missile strike overnight, or an attack on the Marines in Beirut, or something else. Or a tweet, yes, but hang on. And you have to change everything. Because the international alignment which you, perhaps naively, 20 years ago, was built upon principle, has another P involved. There are principles involved, but there's also pragmatism. And principles and pragmatism have to move together. And if we don't know how to keep those in sync, in harmony, forget about any legal instruments, right? However good the ideas may be, however much we may have worked on them. And of course, I haven't finished because I need to tell you about the last P, politicians. Because if any of us in the room are considered by people outside the room to be experts on human rights law, privacy law, etc., and although all of us in the room, we haven't been tasked to negotiate this on behalf of our countries, but let's assume we had been. Had we done so, in the end, what happens? The fruits of 3 years, 5 years, 10 years of work ends up in an overnight consultation. I don't know about you folks, but me, I've had to stay up all night sometimes because I had one ministerial delegation or another squabbling, and in the end, especially if they keep some of the experts out, at 4 o'clock in the morning, at 5 o'clock in the morning, when everybody's knocked out, but they're that close to getting something, somebody says, look, if you give us this, we'll say yes. And you will have spent 3 years to keep that out of a document, and they put it in. So what do? Right? This is why international law is so freakingly weird sometimes. This is why we've created a confusion in Europe between privacy and data protection. Because politicians refuse to admit the truth. How many times have people in this room been asked, so Joe, what's the difference between Article 7 and Article 8 of the European Charter? And some people will somehow strive to tell you, because data protection is slightly different than privacy, which is baloney, which is the polite way to call it bullshit. Because it's not true, ladies and gentlemen, that's not what happened. The international dynamics were that we had a very eminent German, Professor Spiros Simitis, with whom I worked for years in the Committee of Experts on Data Protection in Strasbourg, who was a 3-time term chairman of that committee, who was made chairman of the drafting committee for the European Charter on Fundamental Rights. And if you look carefully at the drafts which came out of there, what you will see is that Simitis, German Greek that he is, took the decision of the German Constitutional Court of 1983 on informational self-determination and put it into the draft of the European Charter. At which, of course, a country which I shall not name, but which is currently going through Brexit, said, no, nothing of the sort. We never signed up to this. So what did they do? They asked the British what they signed up to. We've signed up to, and dragging, I remind you, kicking and screaming, we've signed up to Directive 4695 and data protection. Okay, so what happened? We took informational self-determination out of the draft, we put data protection in. Does it make sense? No. Does it make any form of legal sense? No. But that's what we do. It's called compromise, ladies and gentlemen. It's what happens at the international negotiations level. Does that make international law? Kind of. Because look, we have Article 8, and we have now somehow contrived to have rights arising out of Article 8. Ça va, okay. We're trying to make a compromise work. But does it really make legal logic? No. Those of us with tidy legal minds balk at such things, right? But if we have to be honest, that's the way things happen. I could keep you here until Christmas 2021, giving you examples like these, but I won't, because I have to give the floor to Christophe Péchou. And what I've asked Christophe to do is this. I've asked him, Christophe, you have had more years of experience inside the United Nations than you care to remember, probably, right? Good experience, lovely experiences, bad experiences. And you know the machinations of the House, right? And as you also know, the good things about the House and the great achievements of the United Nations, because there have been many. Can you go away, please, Christophe, and find out what it takes to get international instruments going, and especially with a special focus on any roles, if any, which have been produced or initiated by special rapporteurs? Why? One, to understand how deep the minefield ahead of us is. And two, so that we can have an informed debate. I have no clue what Christophe is going to tell us, right? But I'm really looking forward to it, so that we can have an open debate. And talking about open debate, after being approached by a number of people in the audience, we have taken a decision to switch off the microphones after the coffee break, right? So after the coffee break, sir, no recording until we tell you so, right? So those people who would feel more comfortable speaking without any technology recording them, right, can speak before the coffee break or after the coffee break. We have deliberately not drawn a clean dividing line. If the debate, which will be sparked off by Christophe's intervention, needs to take longer, it takes longer. If it takes shorter, we have a whole bunch of other clauses to do. As Oscar was joking yesterday, we have I don't know how many pages. Oscar and myself are also keen to make sure that we have a discussion on Article 15. But as I said, after we go through what I'm going to call the mechanisms discussion that Christophe will kickstart us off, everybody who would like to come in on anything that deals with the legal instrument, please do so. Except on timing. Timing we're going to deal with in the afternoon, right? I mean, obviously, if timing is a burning part of it, then come up and say so, right? I think that timing is very important. I joke, but not really joke, that the work in intergovernmental negotiations, and including especially negotiating of legal instruments, is very much like that of a comedian. It's all about timing. You get the timing wrong, and the joke falls flat on its face. And in our case here, we have and will have a particular discussion over timing. Because for the umpteenth time, I will repeat, the idea may be great, but the time is not good for it. In the case of data protection and the police, all I will say is this. In 1984 to 1986, when we were drafting Recommendation 8715, and when we found ourselves in some meetings outnumbered 3-1 by the secret services and police forces in the room, everybody told us it's madness. Everybody reminded us there's a wall out there and there's a Cold War going on. The police at first, and this is reminiscent of what happened in the United Nations between 2013 and 2015, the police at first tried to claim that Data Protection Convention 108 doesn't apply to them. They tried to interpret in the same way as a number of countries inside the UN have tried to claim that a right to privacy does not exist. So they tried to claim that data protection law and privacy law does not apply to the police and national security. And we said no, and we won the day. And when I say we, I don't mean. I mean a whole gamut of people, including all those who managed to persuade inside governments, that this was still the right way to go. Timing? Why am I saying this about timing? Because we went from that to something which a number of people have forgotten. In 1992, we actually got a resolution from the politicians, from the 650 or 700 member assembly of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, telling us, you must have a convention on data protection and the police. Get me right, ladies and gentlemen. Only 7 years have passed, and we went from people telling us, you can't have a recommendation, to the politicians telling us, you should have a full-blown treaty about it. And I was actually a rapporteur on police for CJPD at that time, and I said, there's no need. Right? This is the stuff that politics is made of, and this is the stuff that intergovernmental relations are made of. And things will continue to change. So we went from that timing to, as I said, to the influence of Recommendation 8715 to becoming part of the acquis communautaire in 1996, clearly so, to full scale, you have to have it in your law. And this is a development which, and I'm going to stop here, deals with cultural change. I was having discussion with a number of colleagues. We have a number of colleagues in the room who come from law enforcement, and we're discussing what's going to happen with the GDPR and its accompanying directive on police. The truth is, it's culture change. Many police forces in Europe aren't yet prepared for it. It's a pity that our other colleague from Interpol, Caroline, couldn't join us today, because she would tell us, and I've seen John, I've seen Sabine, but she would tell us, Joe, do you know how difficult it is to get my 190 members to kind of produce culture change on privacy and data protection in the police forces? Caroline has a terribly interesting but a terribly difficult job. Now, Interpol haven't been sitting on their ass. They have been working on data protection rules since 1982, right? Even before. Well, I know since 82, Marie, right? No worries. If you look at Interpol's, what do they call them? The IPD, the data protection rules of process. They are how many? 45 pages long? 46 pages? Yeah. How many articles now? 135 articles. So, when you look at that document which comes out of the charter of Interpol, and you see the way that that is trying to influence privacy, data protection, and the police, law enforcement, you would say, is that hard law? Is that soft law? Is it binding? What I do know is it has an effect, right? And that effect is part of the dynamics too. That effect is arising out of the way that Brexit or no Brexit, EU directive or no directive, GDPR or no GDPR, Interpol has been working on its current set of rules very assiduously since at least the current set, since at least, what, 2012, 2013, right? Something of the sort. And you've been, what, through 2 revisions, 3 revisions since then? On average, every 3 years. And I'm saying this because it's another part of the dynamics, right? It's another part of the dynamics which affects directly surveillance and the police. I have at least one master's student who's looking at the blurring lines between police and intelligence when it comes to using software for surveillance. I've had some discussions here in Rome with some people in the room about these matters because they're directly affecting police work and how we train police people. And these things are coming together. And I'm looking forward to working with my colleagues from the UK for IIOF 2018, because this has got to be a subject there. We have got to tackle how on earth do we carry out surveillance being carried out using software bought off the shelf and which can be used by an anti-fraud agency legally, a police force legally, intelligence legally, and it's the same product, therefore with the same vulnerabilities from the same manufacturer, right? It's a practical problem we have. How do we regulate it? Final thing. Part of the theme of what we have been discussing during these past 2 days has been the need for more detailed rules. If you remember, Richard Hill was explaining some things at a fairly high level of principle, but at least 3 times during his speech, Richard turned around and said, but it's not as detailed as what we have in the legal instrument. Those of you who have worked closely with the police and the intelligence services know the value of having something in detail. These guys much prefer, when they're not preferring to have no rules at all, they much prefer to have a detailed set of rules, detailed standard operating procedures. And the truth is that both police forces and intelligence services are much maligned in this, because many of them, and I've seen them go to the legislator and tell him, give us detailed legislation in order that we can proceed properly. And there are a number of European states where this happened, where it was internal pressure from inside the police and the intelligence services asking the legislator to give them more detailed rules. So the creation of detailed rules is of great value to the police forces and the intelligence services. It forms part of what should be a comprehensive legal framework. Because a comprehensive legal framework does not only include the top level right, it also includes the way you apply that right. And the way needs to change, and will continue to need to change as we move from one technology to another. We need to continuously update the rules. Thank you very much for hearing me. I'm going to pass along to Christophe. And Christophe has a presentation. Whether you sit down, walk around, Christophe, it's totally